Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Fundamentals of Cryptography. We are in week 3, and this is your lecture for week 3. So for the agenda for this week, we'll cover the week 3 overview, which will talk about what we'll be doing this week and what the expectation is. We'll also talk about the history of cryptography, talk about our learning this week, and then go over week 4 overview. So the week 3 overview, this week you'll do your reading, which is chapter 2 in our text, The Language of Cryptography, and then you'll listen and watch the lecture, which is what you're doing right now. There is no quiz, so the quiz will be next week, so there is not a quiz this week. There is a discussion question. We will be covering discussion question number 2, and the primary response is due by Wednesday, September 13th, Eastern Time Zone. And the peer response is due by Sunday, September 10th, Eastern Time Zone at midnight. So when talking about the timing of the discussions, just so you understand, our discussions are considered our time in class when you have an opportunity to talk with me and your peers about the learning for the week. And with Wednesday being the primary post due, that is so that we can post early in the week to start getting a dialogue going. And then after you post your primary response, then you'll go back and post a response to one of your peers' primary response. This way we start getting a dialogue going between each other. Even though the primary post is due Wednesday, it's still acceptable it still will be accepted after Wednesday if you just can't make it before that time. But there'll be late penalties assessed for late submission. And you can post up until Sunday night with your peer responses at midnight. After Sunday, the discussion closes. So that would be just like you leaving class for that week, okay? So we cannot have discussions after the week ends, okay? So for this discussion, the primary task response, it's about the Caesar cipher. And Julius Caesar used one of the earliest known cipher systems to communicate with Cicero in Rome while he was conquering Europe. Caesar knew that there was a very high risk of ambush or spies that might get a hold of his messages, right? Therefore, he developed a cryptographic system, which is now known as the Caesar cipher. And when you're talking about the Caesar cipher, answer these following questions. And don't just answer like with one sentence or something. Give me a good solid response. Maybe even look up some additional information and share with the class. What is the Caesar cipher? The ROT3 to be exact. There's others. You can even speak about the others. I think there's an ROT12. And how does it work? Maybe give some examples. Although the Caesar cipher is easy to use, it's also very easy to crack. How would an attacker break a Caesar-style cipher? So give the method that the attacker would use to break that cipher. So the second part of the discussion question is to try your hand. So the first thing for number 1, I want you to encrypt the I will become a cryptographic guru message using the cipher ROT3 cipher. Okay, so how would that be encrypted? And then decrypt the message here that starts with the FRQ using the same cipher. Okay, after that, for the third step, create your own cipher and see who can crack it. So towards the end of the week, after people have been either cracking your cipher or not being able to crack your cipher, post the solution, post the key to your cipher, probably on Sunday or Saturday or Sunday. So this will be fun. Create a nice message in your cipher or something that's interesting and see who can crack it. And that'll be part of your peer response. So you'll read your responses of your peers, which is the primary response and the ciphers, and attempt to crack the cipher codes presented and offer a constructive critique or additional information that adds substantively to the discussions. And be sure to acknowledge any outside sources. So make sure you give a good, robust, academic, graduate level response, okay? And add additional research, additional information that you find in your research to share with the class. So the whole point is to get a good dialogue going, share information, and add to our learning for the week. So let's do a little bit of review. As we talked last week, cryptography is the body of knowledge that relates to the safeguarding of information either by keeping it secret or by keeping unwanted changes from being detected. As we talked about in our discussions last week, crypto provides three key fundamental functions: confidentiality, integrity, and non-repudiation. So let's just review those for a minute just to go back over them. Confidentiality is the concept of safeguarding our data or information from any unauthorized outside party viewing or accessing it in any way, keeping the information confidential. Integrity is provided through a mathematically complex and intensive mechanism known as hashing. If we remember what hashing is, that's the process that converts a message or input into a fixed length encrypted string of information that is typically in an alphanumeric format. Okay, so that's hashing, and hashing is used to maintain the integrity of our information. And finally, non-repudiation. It's also provided by the art of cryptography and gives us the ability to prevent a party from denying their part in initiating activity, right? You can't really for sure say, as we talked about, that somebody is actually sitting behind that keyboard, but you can say it did come from that individual, right? As an information security professional, understanding cryptography is essential for being able to properly carry out your job. So this is something you really need to get your arms around to understand. Like I said, you need to understand how the basic functions and how they're applied. You don't necessarily have to know how to write the algorithms or do the mathematical equations at this point, okay? Now, if you wanted to become a cryptographer, a code breaker, you probably would get into all that. Cryptography is an art that's been around for a very long time, and it's really evolved over the years. It has, in effect, moved from a curiosity to a science, and it's found in most of our current day technology, right? So obviously it's in things, we have in cryptography and encryption in areas such as credit card, e-commerce, email, but it's in most of our daily lives now, right? Because Internet of Things is here, right? Anything that has any, what I had quote unquote smarts, has some kind of cryptography or encryption, or should have, to keep that safe, right? Our cars, your refrigerators, smart houses. So all of that, your phones, and your phones have how much information in that one small device. I can use my phone and click on a link, use my biometrics, or put in a PIN and get into my bank information. I can get into my email. I can get into just about anything, my health records, my medical records through my phone. So that's being transmitted wirelessly, and you're very mobile. Therefore, you have to have a way to encrypt that information to keep it safe. And that's why it's so intertwined in everything we do. And it's going to become more and more so, right? So the exact time that cryptography appeared has not really been specifically pinned down. However, it most likely happened when man learned to write, when they learned to write down information, and they wanted to keep it secret or hide it in some way, right? Since science came into existence, many changes have been made and cryptography has advanced to a high degree. So it started very simple and it's just advanced and advanced and advanced. And because it's so necessary, it's going to keep going, right? It's going to become more and more advanced. Early applications of cryptography included protection of information concerning such things as hunting routes, because they wanted to keep the game to themselves. Food was scarce, right? They didn't want everybody else finding the good hunting routes. And maybe even messages to the gods. And that's what the Egyptians did. More current applications are more complex, like we said, protecting credit card information, email, and information on cellular and mobile devices. Smart cars, all of that, smart houses. So as we talked about the earliest history of cryptography, it may seem like it's a new technology, but it's been around a really long time. It's been around for probably over 4,500 years, 4,500 plus years is what the number is that we think. It's more likely one of the oldest bodies of knowledge that we can find evidence of, although the original systems may not actually be used for the most part anymore. Each one adds something to today's technology and body of knowledge. The knowledge associated with encoding and hiding information is still very much considered mysterious, like the black art, as only a few understand all the logic and mathematics behind it. So we're not going to be learning all the algorithms and the mathematics behind it, but we're going to be learning the application of it and how it's applied. Cryptography still has a veil of mystery surrounding it. And in the old days, they used to think that cryptography was a way to talk to the devil. They called it the dark arts, right? It was a communication with the underworld and spirits. For many of us, probably the first time we ever got an inkling of cryptography was when we saw an encrypted message from the Egyptians' hieroglyphics, as you can see in this image right here. The intricate and complex system of writing, it was used for religious and spiritual purposes by the Egyptians. Although over 4,500 years ago, the Egyptians most likely were not trying to keep secrets for the same reasons we are today. There is evidence suggests they were trying to keep the ability to communicate with their gods somewhat controlled. In fact, it is believed that only members of the royal family and members of religious orders could fully understand how to read and write the complex designs. Although that's just the best guess, we really don't know. We think that that's why the Egyptians used it, but there's really no proof of it either way. The knowledge needed to read and write this beautiful complex system was so restricted that when the last person capable of writing it died, which was over 1,000 years ago, the knowledge was lost until a French soldier unwittingly uncovered the key to deciphering hieroglyphics in 1799. So hieroglyphics is probably the best example of cryptography, and it began around 2000 BC in Egypt. They were commonly used to decorate the tombs of deceased rulers and kings, as well as their very important people, their VIPs, right? The pictures served as a way to illustrate the story of life of the deceased and proclaim the great acts of their lives. So it told their story. It told their story of who they were and what they did and what they achieved in their life, kind of a way to keep them immortalized, right? It seems that the writing was intended by its designers to be purposefully cryptic. However, they did not intend to hide it. So they wanted to put it on the tombs to tell their story. To researchers now, it seems that the writing system was designed to provide an additional sense of importance or regal appearance. As time went by, the developed writings became even more complicated, and eventually the public turned to other pursuits and lost interest in deciphering them. So right at first there was a big push and oh, this was so important, and then they found out that, well, okay, it's just telling the story of all these people that they thought were important, and how to their important people and their their leaders and religious leaders were the ones that were involved in it. It really wasn't what a part of the common man at the time. Okay, so while it was very important for scholars in Europe. They really had a big push to try to understand the hieroglyphics, and it took them a long time because the last person that could decipher it, of course, had died thousands of years ago. But the missing piece came along that helped them decipher it. And it turned out to be the famous Rosetta Stone. You guys have probably heard about this. This stone was discovered by a soldier in the French army in 1799. Like we said, it had become the hieroglyphics couldn't be understood until this French soldier discovered it in 1799. He discovered the Rosetta Stone. The stone was eventually transferred to English control after they defeated the French army in Egypt. Due to the work of experts and over 20 years of hard work, the ancient language was decoded and reintroduced into the world. The language could be read once again, and the world could enjoy the culture that had been lost. The Rosetta Stone went on to become a household name even today, with the stone itself having a home in the British Museum. So here's another picture of some hieroglyphics that we see in how they really looked. And that would be very hard to tell that story, wouldn't it? And here is the Rosetta Stone. So wow, how that's amazing, isn't it? That you could take that and use that to decipher the hieroglyphics. So this was the missing piece to the puzzle. Now the Egyptians weren't the only ones that had that used cryptography or some form of hiding their writings, right? That China also did it. The Chinese had a unique nature in their language to obscure and transform the meaning of messages for those not intended to see them. They could easily hide the meaning of the message and hide the true meaning of the message, keeping the privacy intact. But they transformed their language, and even though that they were good at transforming their language, it didn't really have widespread use, so it pretty much died out. And back at the time, Genghis Khan was the ruler, and it doesn't show any evidence that he used any kind of cryptography during his conquest, but if history is any indication, Genghis Khan had such a strong army that he was so fast and so strong that he would probably beat the messages anywhere anyway. So there probably wasn't really any use for him with that. So the Chinese civilization, it really didn't take off. India also had a type of cryptography, and they used it more than the Chinese did, about the same time. In India, it was known that the government at various times had used special codes and ciphers to communicate with their spies, who were part of their early intelligence network. Although the codes were simplistic compared to those in use today, they were very effective in concealing the meaning of message from outsiders. The early Indian ciphers consisted largely of what we now know as simple substitutions based on phonetics, okay? This method, what's interesting is this method is much like when you were in elementary school, or some were in elementary school like I was, and we learned Pig Latin, right? And that's what the Indian ciphers, substitution ciphers, were like. That you would replace the first consonant at the end of the word followed by the sound A. This method, like AY, this method may seem simple, especially for those of us who used to speak it in the playground, but it was effective at the time. Another one, well-known encryption techniques from the ancient world, comes from Mesopotamians. They specialize in symbols, what they call it the cuneiform, to convey information. With cuneiform, the deciphering process was simpler than that of the earlier example involving the Egyptians, but it still took some time to break it. There was also a little-known example of cryptography, what is known as Atbash. It comes from the Hebrew language and the Bible. The cipher was simple in design and concept, but in implementation it was straightforward compared with later ciphers. Essentially, the design of the technique flipped the characters of the alphabet with the characters of the end, replacing the ones at the beginning. So your text kind of shows an example of this. Once this was done, the letters were substituted accordingly, and then your text will show you kind of how it looks. Some have cited that the Atbash cipher as the possible inspiration for what is known as the Bible Code. The Bible Code is thought to be the way the creators of the Bible hid messages and prophecy within the work. Whether or not this is actually true is still under debate, but the idea is intriguing. It's very interesting, right? And I'm sure some of you have heard of Atbash and the Bible Code. The Spartans used something called the I always say it wrong, but it's Siddeley, which was popular with the Spartans. And here's an example. So what they would do, it's very different than the other types of methods that we've talked about, but You would take a wooden dowel and you'd wrap leather around it. And as you wrapped it, prior to examining the message, it would just look wrapped. The sender would take the strip of leather or parchment and wrap it around their dowel and inscribe the message in several lines across the parchment, rotating the dowel at each line until each line was completed. After the message was inscribed, the parchment was unwrapped and sent to the intended recipient, who would wrap the parchment around their dial, and it had to be the same size, the same diameter, right, to read the message. This method of encoding messages, although simple, was popular in a handful of ancient civilizations, including the Greeks and in particular the Spartans, who used it to transmit messages on the battlefield. So that's neat. You had to have the same size dial, and they would wrap the leather, put their message on, take it off, send it over, then the receiver would wrap it back around and read the message. So the next one, in our discussion we talked about the Caesar cipher. So the Caesar cipher is a simple but effective process. It's been around for over 2,000 years. Julius Caesar used this cipher to encrypt or encode his messages to his commanders in the field, for the same reason the military probably do it today, right? To keep sensitive information private. Although the cipher is simple, it is still in use today, and in fact is one that most school children will be familiar with because it appeared in countless puzzle game books and cereal boxes over the years. I remember there was a cipher. If you were part of this super spy ring, as a kid, you could sign up and you'd get this special ring, and it would have a secret code, and they'd give it to you, and you could go and you decipher the code. And it was so exciting. But with the Caesar cipher, the process Caesar used shifted each letter 3 places further in the alphabet, sometimes forward, sometimes back. For instance, Y became B and R shifts to U. Although the process could use any shift amount, you could be a 3, a 10, a 5, a 2. Caesar settled on a shift of 3 spaces. It was effective at keeping the secrets at the time because anyone encountering the message would most likely assume it was a foreign language, if they could read it at all. So as you can see here, this is what the first line is, a substitution cipher. And if you take that very first line, you just jumbled it all together, then you could decipher it with the Caesar cipher, and it would say hello cryptography class. But it was vulnerable, and it was vulnerable to frequency analysis. And frequency analysis, where you could check and see, like the ETAN, Etanarish, is also tells you how frequently. It's a listing of letters in the alphabet in descending order of their frequency of use in English. So the E is the most frequent, then the T, then the A, then the N. So if you were able to find, like, say you put spaces and you'd have 3 letters, like the word the, and you could see where it was placed, or you, like with the Japanese, they used a formal way of speaking, so it was easy to say, okay, they always start their sentences with this statement, so we can decipher it that way, and it was easy to break the code that way. So ENTANORISH, frequency analysis, was a very easy way to break Caesar's code. So here's an example of the Caesar cipher. Okay, and it can become any of these. A becomes D, B becomes E, C becomes F. So moving from that period into the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, most of the new ciphers came from Italy, and specifically Venice. And a new organization was created in 1452 to deal with the issues involving cryptography. And so one very famous person emerged, Leon Battista Alberti, in 1452. He created the polyalphabetic substitution cipher. Alberti is known as the father of Western cryptography. Okay, Alberti was responsible for the development of a technique known as Polyalphabetic substitution. This technique is still widely used by many modern-day processes and mechanisms. Essentially, this process relies on substituting different characters for the same unencrypted symbol. This technique came into being after Alberti reviewed how other existing ciphers were compromised or broken, and then envisioned a technique that could thwart those messages. So Alberti's technique was essentially simple in concept but powerful in practice. Polyalphabetic substitution makes cryptanalysis harder because multiple alphabets are used in the process. The initial mechanism was simple, being nothing more than two copper discs with the entire alphabet written upon each of them. To encrypt the message, the encrypting party chose a letter in the outer ring and lined it up with the inner ring. The inner ring represented the letters in the encrypted message, unencrypted message, and the inner the encrypted message. So the outer was unencrypted and the inner was encrypted. By matching up the unencrypted with the ones in the inner ring, one could quickly translate a message into another form that was unreadable without knowing the settings that were used. What made this process more complicated is because every so many letters, they would redo the discs, okay, and they would change it. They would change a few words. They would change a few letters. And it helped to keep code breakers from breaking the code. So there was the Vinage cipher, was a much more complex form of Alberti's cipher. It came next. It used 26 alphabets instead of Alberti's 2, so it made it even more complex. The Vinage cipher is much more complex because it uses the 26 unique and distinct alphabets as opposed to Alberti's 2. Each alphabet is the same except each one is shifted by one letter. So that makes it interesting. Each row is a representation of the Caesar cipher and represents a shift of some given number, with row number 1 representing a shift of 1, row number 2 representing a cipher alphabet with a shift of 2, and so on. So here's a link that you can go to get how it works. But to use this method, a different row is used to encrypt each letter in a message. In other words, the sender of the message would encrypt their message with each letter being encrypted by a different row. In order to decode the message, the recipient would be aware of which row of the matrix was used to encrypt each letter. Then there had to be a way to agree how the switch between the rows would occur. The agreement is achieved via the selection of a keyword. So they used a keyword, so it made it really a lot more complex, didn't it? It was much later that this last cipher with Alberti was broken, but it took it quite a while. So cryptography came on, and it wasn't, it was used here and there, and organizations and states and nations had ways of doing cryptography. But it may not have been as popular across the board until the invention of the telegraph in 1844. The telegraph made communication between remote parties much quicker and quite convenient, but what it didn't bring was security. So the telegraph, you could send messages far and wide very quickly, but there was no security at the time. So to secure the transmissions and make the system safer for its users, special ciphers were needed. Okay. At the same time, the general public interest in the technology grew substantially when the telegraph came along, with many individuals taking a stab at creating their own unique ciphers designed to protect this information. What made the situation with the telegraph even more of a big deal was the fact that the military used the technology to transmit communications between locations. So the military was using the telegraph, so they needed a way to secure this information, right? In fact, the invention of the telegraph system was the first time in history that the commander of an army could be in near instantaneous contact with troops and commanders in the field. But, even though they had created ciphers with the telegraph, they started showing their age. Over time, they all do, right? But during the Civil War, one of the ciphers used a great deal was the old school Vigenère cipher, right? The one we talked about with the 26 alphabets. So they were still using this in the Civil War. The same cipher from 300 years before. And it was being used virtually unchanged. When the Confederacy decided to encrypt messages, they relied on this system, which was 300 years old, which led to a tremendous amount of messages being broken by the Union. The Confederacy made the job even easier by the Union by reusing codes, especially three phrases. They used Manchester Bluff, Complete Victory, and Come Retribution. These three codes were discovered by the Union cryptanalyst Tinker, Chandler, and Bates. The South's messages were regularly deciphered by the Union. General Grant commented that at one point the Union had gotten enough intelligence from the decrypted messages that it may very well have shortened the war. So Ulysses S. Grant said that because of intelligence gained from code breaking, that was how they were able to win the war. So it was attributed to cryptography. Okay, so something to be noted. Prior to the 20th century, cryptography was mainly focused on patterns formed from linguistic and other similar based systems. However, from the beginning of the 20th century forward, the situation changed as newer systems introducing number theory, algorithms, algebra, and other high-end mathematics that had not existed before were being used in the systems. So in the 1920s, technology introduced machinery to assist the cryptographic process. Cryptographic devices were a game changer in the making, and they impacted both cryptography and cryptanalysis as a whole. There were a bunch of different machines that were used, but no matter what they looked like or the relative complexity, the encryption process was more or less the same as it had always been. But it was still just a little bit more advanced because of the new technology and the new machines, right? But later in the 1920s, it was one of the landmark items of cryptography was introduced in the form of the Enigma machine. How many of you have heard of the Enigma machine? It's pretty famous, right? This machine has emerged as one of the most famous examples of a cryptographic device, and it's been praised as well as loathed because it was related to the Nazis, right? The Enigma machine was nothing more than a simple mechanical encryption device that was widely used in the 1920s forward. The device was actually used by multiple governments, but it achieved a certain level of notoriety being used by the Nazi Party during the war. The device resembled outwardly an old school typewriter, but it had very complex inner workings, right? So here's what it looked like. It was used in Germany in World War II. There was a special version for the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine, and the Japanese created their own version, right? So you see what it looks like, kind of like you said, it looks like a typewriter. Here's an example. It's pretty interesting, isn't it? But it had, let's see, it also had, here's the rotors inside. So you see the outside, right? And then you see the rotors inside. It's very, very interesting. Although in theory the Enigma was incredibly strong, it had to be used strictly by the book, okay? And it had to follow certain protocols. It could not be changed. The users of the system did not follow those strictly. They weren't so disciplined, especially later in the war, which led to the reuse of some of the combinations of codes. And with this reuse, the system became compromised. So they still thought their messages, Germany still thought their messages were secret, but they were actually being intercepted and read by Allied powers. So yeah, as you can see here, it can be very complex, but it had to follow certain protocols and procedures without any fluctuation in order for it to stay strong. The Enigma was initially broken in 1929 by a group of 3 Polish mathematicians led by Marian Rejewski. And this group was to provide the foundation for the later coup of German intelligence and cryptography. And the Poles were able to use this combined information to build their own Enigma machine in 1933. And once it was built, the team was able to use mathematical equations to determine the configuration of the system. So as we probably heard with history, the Enigma and the accompanying cipher was the backbone of the German military, right? That was their thing. It was used both in land and naval operations. And originally it was invented in 1918. It was originally designed in financial communications, such as banks, but it never achieved much success in that area. But the German military, however, did see the value in the system and adopted it for communications. So the Polish people built their own and then handed over this code and the code breaking to the Allied forces, and then they were able to actually start working with it. So the British, let's see where we are here. Okay, the British unit Ultra was responsible for breaking the Enigma code, and it was based in Bletchley Park. And the code name, of course, was Ultra. It was worked on by over 9,000 people, and notably worked on by Alan Turing, and it was referenced in the film The Imitation Game. So the Ultra group was very secretive, and even years after the war in 1967, due to the secret nature of the unit, many of the former workers that are still alive will not speak about their activities to this day. So it was highly secret at the time. So another code was known as the JN-25 by the United States, which was used by the Japanese Imperial Navy. The code was named this because it was the 25th separate code identified by the U.S. The code evolved several times after its introduction in 1939 and was updated just prior to the Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor. The version was introduced on December 4th, 1941, and that version was completely broken by the U.S. codebreakers, which led to the events later in 1942. This code allowed the U.S. to get forewarning of the upcoming attack on Midway Island. So the JN-25, or Japanese Purple, is a variant of the Enigma. It didn't use rotors, but it was broken by the U.S. MAGIC program prior to the start of U.S. entry into World War II. And the intelligence gathered gave huge advantage to the Americans during the Battle of Midway. Now, even though they say Admiral Chester Nimitz had at his disposal a team at Pearl Harbor that had broken this code, and as a result of breaking the code, the battle was decisive because the Japanese had misused their encryption, and it allowed the U.S. Navy to know the size of the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy, the strength and the general direction of the attacking force. General Nimitz was even able to use the broken messages to understand the tactics that would be employed against him, and using his own force carefully deployed to work against the Japanese weakness, the Americans were able to win the Battle of Midway. So it's to note that yes, they used the JN-25, their knowledge of this were able to break it, and they were able to know the strength, the size, the general direction, and exactly how they were going to work against the Americans. Still, Admiral Chester Nimitz, still his forces were very strong and were able to overcome the Japanese at that point. So here's the machine. Okay, so that's, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Interesting, isn't it? Purple analog number 1. That'd be really interesting to see those in person. So In the middle of the part of the 1970s, there was a new technique, and it was published in encryption that was known as the Data Encryption Standard, or DES. I'm sure you guys have heard of this. It was the first public acknowledgement of the technology, was in fact made in 1975, and IBM submitted it to the federal government to be adopted as their standard. It was supposed to be used to protect the increasing amount of electronic communications, and the federal government did accept it after certain adjustments were made by the NSA. So after the NSA adopted it, then it became a lot more public. So it gained public recognition as becoming a public and formal approved standard by the NSA. So therefore, the academic community became more involved, more research was done, more knowledge was obtained. DES lasted a long time and was only showing its age in the early 1990s. So it went from the 70s to the 90s. In fact, the DES was eventually broken routinely during the 1990s. So once you break an encryption code, it's time for a new one. And probably before it starts getting broken, you probably should have another one on the shelf, right? Because it started getting broken, a replacement was sought to compensate for the increase in computing power and the increase in technology. So by the end of the 1990s, they had a competition to determine the successor for DES. The competition eventually came up with two winners. One was a derivation of DES, also which was known as triple DES, and another one was AES, or Advanced Encryption Standard. Both were formally recognized by the NSA, and they were seen as replacements for DES. And those two have been widely used ever since. And then you've heard of the RSA algorithm, right? So that is kind of our history of cryptography. In a nutshell, there's more information in your text. There's some really good stories to go over. This was just fascinating to me, and I hope that you find it just as fascinating. So let's look a little bit about what we're going to do for week 4. Just a quick overview. For your reading, you'll be reading chapter 3, which is the components of cryptography. Once again, we'll have a lecture, and you'll have quiz 2, which will, I believe it's still another 10 questions. And we'll go over more of that next week. So please send me a message or post a message in the questions area if you do have any questions or if you need some clarification. So I should have your papers graded shortly. Your discussion, not your papers, your discussions graded early in the week. But one thing to remember, I am in Southwest Georgia, so I am probably going to be in the eye of Irma. Irma's coming up. This is Sunday evening, and Irma is coming up and should be here sometime later this evening, with Monday being the most difficult probably, with widespread power outages, wind, and that sort of thing. So if I don't get back with you until Tuesday, that's probably why, and maybe hopefully by Tuesday. If not, I do have some power sources, so hopefully I'll be able to keep up with you as long as there's not widespread power outages, but they are expected. Anyway, so if any of you are in the eye of the storm or any of the outlying areas, which is huge in the south here right now, please be safe. And if you have any questions, post them, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you guys. I appreciate you for joining. Bye. Have a great week.